Like this show and want to make your own? Let me tell you about Anchor. It's free, and they have creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. And now you can even add any song from Spotify directly to your episodes. The possibilities are endless for what you can create, whether it's music analysis, your own radio show, or something the world's never heard before. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. And you can also make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
To the Vocal Fries Podcast, the podcast about linguistic discrimination.
I'm Carrie Gillen.
And I'm Megan Figueroa. And we got to see each other this weekend. Or this Friday.
Yes, we did.
Yeah, it's really cool because that's not normally how it goes. No. We don't see each other often anymore since I moved to Tucson. And it's funny because casual listeners, or maybe just people who listen all the time but didn't realize, we don't record in the same room.
No. Many people have commented that they think we sound like we're in the same room, which is a nice compliment.
Yeah.
But no, we're not, usually. Every once in a while we are, but it's rare.
It's rare. Like, we had a couple interviews. We got to interview our friend Ursula Orr, Dr. Ursula Orr, in the same room, and that was fun. But yeah, no, we're mostly on Skype, which is a testament to technology, I guess. But also, like, we've known each other for years, so it's not, like, awkward. So that probably could be a thing, too.
I guess so. I mean, I used to find it kind of awkward, but now it's like, whatever. I don't know you, but we're talking on Skype. It's fine.
Oh, yeah. I've had to get over a lot of reservations about meeting people via Skype and then just, like, diving in and asking them personal questions.
Well, we don't ask them super, well, I guess somewhat personal.
Yeah. It's true, though. Like, when you think about it, I mean, I've said it so many times, like, when we interview people, and sometimes I get, like, chills or start having feels because language is so personal for people.
It is personal, it's true. But we don't normally ask them a super personal question. It usually just comes up.
It's true. Yeah. Just because it's so, like, inherent in the topic.
Yes. Yeah.
It's pretty natural a thing to talk about, how it makes you feel. But yeah, so, and even more coincidentally, the fact that I saw you this weekend is that we saw our guest.
Yes, it just happened to be the case that Dr. Andrew McKenzie was giving a talk at Arizona.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It was really cool. And
he's been
your friend since way back, right?
Yeah, for over a decade now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, well, I guess I met him about a decade ago, almost, in Portland.
Almost, yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah, it's funny. So I said to him. So I was with him and Dr. Robert Henderson, who's at University of Arizona. And so there were three semanticists hanging out, which I know scared you. But I said in front of Robert to Andrew, "Hey, we should get a selfie for the podcast, obviously."
Right. And
Robert didn't really put that together, and he's like, "Oh, did you guys go to school together or something?" And or do you just like each other? And I'm like, "Yeah, we're friends, but like, no, it's for the podcast.
Yeah.
I don't just randomly ask for selfies."
Well, a lot of people do. So
yes. Yeah, it's not completely. Well, but he wouldn't need an excuse for it, right? So
sure, yeah.
Anyway,
that's funny.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's funny because I actually. So I heard that you were with two other semanticists, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to stop. And I saw a person wearing a linguistics shirt. I'm going to ask if they're linguists because I'm going to avoid getting to that conversation of three semanticists.
And somewhat ironically, we barely touched on semantics. It was only at the very end of the conversation that we did.
That's so funny.
But then he gave a talk about formal semantics with lots of lambdas.
Lots of lambdas, lots of mews. I actually don't know if that's true.
There's no mews. Okay. Well, there might have been a mew. I don't think so, though. I would be very surprised if there was a mew.
Well, and I say this only because Carrie's cats are lambda and mew. like the true nerd that she is.
Yeah, but we use lambda calculus in semantics. But there's also a lambda mu calculus, which I don't think I've ever even seen. But I also just called her Mew because it sounds like Mew.
Oh, it does. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a cute cat name.
It is a very cute cat name.
But yeah.
But at vets, often the first time they meet her, they're like, oh, is her name Moo? Because it's just spelled M-U. And I'm like, no, the Greek letter. And then one time, one of them asked me, oh, were you in a sorority?
Oh, no.
Like, the only reason you would know Greek letters.
Yeah, and you were like, you don't know how untrue that is, or not true that is.
Like yeah, kind of the opposite.
That's so funny. Well, it's also a testament to just like, was this in America? Yeah, because you got them when you were here. Just like the only reason that Americans would know Greek letters.
It did feel kind of like an American question to me.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. We don't learn things unless we have to know them for some reason.
Oh, no. Well, yeah. Or you're super into it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so maybe I should bring up, this is not really at all about America, but hey, let me teach you a thing that exists outside of America.
Yeah, I mean, I never forget that you're Canadian. It's just thrown in my face at all times when I'm...
At all times. I always make sure people know. That's not true. There's sometimes where I just don't say anything because I'm like, oh, this person does not need to know.
Right.
Okay, so there's been a couple of things going on in Quebec recently that are language related, and probably you could say that all the time.
Yeah.
Because Quebec is fiercely protective of French, and that is absolutely legitimate. Mm-hmm. But sometimes it leads to weird results. So here's the headline from the New York Times. For Quebec, a French woman may not be French enough.
Oof.
So she was denied a certificate that she needs before she can settle permanently in Quebec to become a permanent resident on the grounds that she has not demonstrated sufficient proficiency in French because she wrote one chapter of her doctoral dissertation in English rather than in French. One chapter.
There must have been a reason for it. I mean, but that's beside the point. But I'm like guessing that there was a reason for it.
So it had already been published in a scientific journal, and so it was already in English, so that's why she kept it in English.
Aha, see? There you go. Yeah, and so the headline, I'm thinking, it's just, it always goes back to the fact, like, are you French enough? Are you Latinx enough? Like, anything. It's just, how...
Are you American enough? Are you whatever? Yeah.
How integral language is to identity and how that's very, very important, and you have every right to protect your identity if it's linked to your language, obviously. But then, you have people like me who have such a complicated history where like I can break out in tears thinking about how like language is actually making my identity, or people try to take away my identity because of language. So it's just what a topic.
What a clusterfuck.
Yeah. What? All the feels.
All the feels. Yeah, it's terrible.
But yeah, it's just another example of how we weaponize language against people. And another thing where it's like, language is always in the news. So
language is always in the news. I'm always like, what are we going to talk about? Oh yeah, there's this thing.
That thing. Yeah. And then we're like, okay, well, this one isn't as depressing as the other one, so let's talk about this one this week. Well, it's a fun interview because, we're talking with someone we've known or know, IRL. So hopefully, but we're also keeping with the year of Indigenous languages. We're talking about Kiowa.
Yeah. Which has a different name that I do not know how to pronounce because I have only heard it once.
Yeah.
When Andrew said it on Friday, I was like, wait, what? There's a different word for it?
Yes.
So I apologize to all Kiowas that I don't know how to say the Kiowa people and language name properly.
Yeah. But yeah, hope you enjoy.
So today we have Dr. Andrew McKenzie, who is an associate professor of semantics and Native American languages at the University of Kansas.
Is this a repeat offender? Our first repeat offender?
I think it's our first repeat offender, yeah. We've asked him to come back because we wanted him to talk about Kiowa, because he works on Kiowa. He's a citizen of the Kiowa tribe of Oklahoma. His great-grandfather, Parker McKenzie, created one of the Kiowa alphabets, and he got an NSF/NEH grant to document and revitalize the language. So welcome, Andrew.
Thank you for having me back.
Of course.
I didn't realize that bit about your grandfather. That's really cool.
Yeah, it's my great-grandfather. But
your great-grandfather.
Yeah. So in the Kiowa term, he would be my big brother. Because they kind of repeat the terms after 3 generations. So,
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Very cool.
I guess the way you would say it nowadays is that he was a nerd. And I mean that in the most positive way. So
of course.
He would, what he would do is just kind of document things that came to him and try to work things out. And so this includes lists of thousands of different words organized by syllable content or by other means. Sometimes, he had some documents written about the grammar of the language, and the way that he writes is very, he's not a trained linguist, but he had the linguistic mind, and he was very attuned. Phonologically aware, grammatically aware, and that sort of thing. So you can read his stuff, and it sounds like a linguist. It's better than some linguists today, even.
Yeah.
I won't name names.
Better than Jeff. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
Oh, well. That goes without saying. No. When I do field work, I like to hit the archives in Oklahoma City. There's an archive where his papers are, and I like to read his papers because you kind of get the sense like of working with him almost, because his judgments and his commentary is extremely helpful. So, and he worked with linguists going back 80 years. So he lived a very, very long time, which is good to hear. And he worked with John Harrington, who was one of the early ethnologists, who is probably the subject of many a podcast. But he worked with him on all of his projects, and they even co-wrote a very small reference, like a sketch of a reference grammar sort of thing in the 40s. And then Harrington ghosted on him, as Harrington was wont to do. And but it's really interesting though. So he developed this writing system in part to pass notes to his girlfriend at school. Because
so cute.
Because I know it's adorable.
Well, yeah, because if the teacher catches the note, he reads it in front of the class. It's embarrassing. But then if it just looks like gibberish, then whatever, right? And so, so he kind of eyeballed it, and then it worked. And I mean, it did work, right? They ended up together and were fruitful
Here
and
you
multiplied.
Are.
Yes.
Yeah.
And yes, it all led to this moment right here. This is what he had in mind.
Yeah. When he was creating this alphabet, this writing system, were there a lot of speakers at the time of Kiowa?
Yeah, most of the tribes spoke Kiowa pretty routinely, and there weren't a lot of members. So even there was the earliest census numbers at the turn of the century. It was maybe 1,000 people. But Kiowa was pretty routinely spoken, and it wasn't until the 20s and 30s that you start getting generations not raised in Kiowa at all. And then so since then it's been tailing off, and the people I work with were typically born in that last generation. So they're pushing 80, 90 years old now. But although I will say that they are pretty active. So I feel like a lot of the stuff that they do for cultural and language revitalization keeps them going. I think that adds to their lifespan quite a bit. And I mean, they're not, the oldest person I worked with was 95. And then Parker himself, my great grandfather, lived to 101. And he was typing letters, right up to the end. So, and I have his typewriter.
Oh, very cool.
So I noticed your typewriter in the Skype.
Yeah.
That
I feel so like typewriterless.
The listeners don't see that, but
yeah.
yeah. So my wife got some ribbon off the internet somewhere, and it works out pretty well. So yeah, I find that it's actually
really cool.
easier to type glossing on a typewriter than in Word.
Because you can move the paper, right? Like right where you need it to
exactly.
be.
Yeah, you can, and it doesn't try to help you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
yes,
I know.
Well, I remember when Word used to not try to help you, and then I wanted to throw my computer across the room. So
exactly.
Yeah. So did Parker then pass on Kiowa to his children?
No. So he and his wife would speak to each other in Kiowa, but not to their kids. They spoke English to their kids, and none of their kids grew up Kiowa speaking. One of those ironies of life, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting, because you might think that he would be one of the few people who'd be like, no, I got it. I created an alphabet.
But I mean, that was the time, right?
Yeah, no, it's definitely the time.
Yeah, everyone was raised to not be Indian. And so...
Yeah.
And Parker was very much one of the Kiowas. He was one of the Kiowas who was happy to have a foot into the modern way. And so he went to college, and he worked at the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the money. So he helped handle the accounts for the trust money and that sort of stuff. And but then at the same time, he had a foot on the traditional ways, and he was one of the first organizers of the American Indian Exposition in Anadarko, which is one of the first intertribal fairs that really kind of got going the modern powwow circuit sort of thing. So,
wow.
And he was also really interested in genealogy, and he's actually the best genealogist for the tribe as well. And he would trace people's histories back, and he had file cabinets full of people's genealogies.
Wow.
And so people would come to him, just drive out to his farmhouse and try to see what their ancestry was. And so his own ancestry, which I guess would make mine as well, he was able to trace back to the mid-1600s or so. And the dates are obviously approximate, but still, yeah. And so, according to his chart I am like 1/512th crow. So.
Oh.
So there you go.
Now you're sounding like a white person.
No, well, it's funny because there's a lot of that's the thing. There's a lot of intertribal marriage, right?
Of course, yeah, tons.
And the Kiowas were allies with the Crow for a long time, so it's not really a surprise, but it's one of those things that's funny. Now, the thing that makes me sound white is that his grandfather was a Mexican captive. And so then whatever you want to do the math, then I'm part Mexican in that sense. Now, that actually kind of was a ding against him when he was alive, that he was descended from a captive. And so it's a bit of a snobbery issue at that. But so he didn't speak, he and his wife didn't speak Kiowa with their kids. And so, so any of us who've learned it since then had to learn it as a second language, basically.
Right. Yeah. And did you start doing that when you became a linguist, or did you become a linguist because you were learning? How did that go?
I guess it's a trick question because they're not quite related in that sense. So.
Okay.
So I got into linguistics because I was into languages in high school, and I was teaching myself languages that my school didn't offer, which is most of them. And I had an older brother in college who was like, "Oh, I took a linguistics course. I bet you'd like that." And so I checked it out. I was like, "Yeah, I do like that." And so I was one of those rare weirdos who was a linguistics major when they started college.
Yeah, that is rare and weird.
Yeah.
I didn't even know it existed. It took me a whole year to find it. Well, I guess half a year, I guess, to find it.
And that's faster than most people.
Yeah, it is.
So, but then for Kiowa, I started learning that, and so I was always aware of Kiowa because when we'd go to Parker's house, like for Christmas or holidays or other things like that, then he would always teach us a Kiowa lesson.
Oh,
in fact, he wouldn't let people leave his house without a Kiowa lesson. So
that's awesome.
And
I'm so jealous.
So he would just grab like either a piece of paper and write stuff out for us, or use his chalkboard and stuff like that. And my older brother found this ancient home video of me like looking up at rapt in attention to this language lesson, which I don't remember, but it is clearly me on the video with my bowl haircut. So, so it was always a little bit of that, but I didn't really get into it until I was at OU, at Oklahoma, for college, because they offer courses in several Indian languages for credit, and now you can take them for your language credit instead of.
That's awesome.
Spanish, or French, or whatever, right? Although, I say that with feigned disdain. I was a French major too.
And your wife is French.
My wife is French, right?
Yeah,
that's true.
Sounds like you forgot that for a second.
So are the who is teaching Kiowa at Oklahoma?
At the time, it was Gus Palmer, who's an anthropology professor, and he's written a lot of books about storytelling and the native modes of storytelling, especially in Kiowa, and how the line between the line that in Western culture is clear between the real and the mythical isn't quite so clear in Indian storytelling, that sort of thing. So he was teaching those classes, and he was friends with Parker, and so the materials built a lot out of that, and they were actually very linguistically oriented. So they were also developed out of Laurel Watkins's reference grammar, which Parker helped with a lot. And so the materials were pretty complex. For a linguistics major, they were awesome. So it was like, we're going to talk about aspect today. I'm like, I know what aspect is.
Maybe explain what aspect is, just in case people don't know.
So aspect is an inflectional category of verbs that is actually more important than tense, but less well taught because people teach verbs wrong.
Yes, they do. Oh my God, yes.
So essentially, aspect. So different. Okay, aspect. The term is confusing because it covers a lot of different things. But what I'm talking about is what's sometimes called viewpoint aspect, where we're talking about essentially the nature of the event as it relates to the time in question. So if I say, when I was taking a shower, Carrie called, then you get the sense when I say I was taking a shower that I was in the midst of doing this. And if you say when I took a shower, Carrie called, you get the sense that there's a sequence at play. But all of those are in past tense. So tense isn't that issue. What's issue is the aspect of whether we're talking about a slice of the event that could continue or not, or whether we're talking about the entire event as a whole. Now, as it happens, this viewpoint aspect is crucial for a language, to the point that every language I've ever heard of, with maybe one exception, marks aspect in some way.
Even English.
Definitely English.
Of course, English.
English barely marks things.
Whereas,
overtly.
Whereas maybe half of the world's languages do not mark tense at all, including Kiowa. And 99% of the time, tense is completely superfluous. Because it tells us the relationship between the topic time, what we're talking about, and the utterance time, when we're talking. So the past tense says, I'm talking about this time that's before today. But the first thing we do in conversations, almost every time, is establish the topic time. So we almost never don't know. So the tense is telling us nothing we don't already know, almost every time. And so you can dispense with it. It is a superfluous category, but our grammar makes us do it in English. And Kiowa does not. There's no tense marking. So aspect is really important. But yeah, the materials in the course really had these terms, because it was just, how do you talk about aspect? How do you talk about ejectives, right?
Mm-hmm. Ooh, you have to describe what that is too, just in case.
You said it. You said it.
So ejectives are basically popped sounds. They're made by a really cool articulation where you make the sound, you make a consonant, but while you're making the consonant, you also close off your vocal folds. And then when you release them together, you make this super pressure chamber that pops really loud. So in Kiowa, you could say something like ball, or you could say ball, right? So ball is the ejective. You can hear that difference. Or you can take a word like, or a stem like tall, which means sitting down, if it's in a certain form. And then all, the adjective, which means stay. It's a different word, that sort of thing. And that kind of difference. So Kiowa is peculiar because amongst plains languages, it's the only one with adjectives like that.
Oh, I didn't know that.
It's and some other plains languages are like Creek.
Right? No. Creek is an Eastern language.
Oh.
That they got removed to Oklahoma, but other plains languages would be like the Siouan languages, like Lakota. Crow is another one. Cheyenne, Arapaho, Pawnee, that sort of thing. But Kiowa is not linguistically related to those languages anyways. So Kiowa is actually related to the languages spoken in the Pueblo areas of New Mexico.
Oh, wow. I had no idea.
And, well, neither did anyone else until linguists were like, hey, these are very similar languages.
Yeah. Is that just like a migration thing?
Yes. Yeah, they migrated north and then migrated south.
Okay.
But so they're associated with the Southern Plains, the Kiowas. But historically, we're by the Yellowstone area.
Oh, wow. Okay.
As late as the 1700 or so. And then the Kiowas just kind of drifted their way down the plains. They lived in the Black Hills until the Sioux pushed the Cheyenne to push them and so forth. It was a lot of mess. And then once on the southern plains, that Kiowas allied with the Comanches and then kind of entered this era people are more familiar with. At some point in the past, they would have been together. We don't know how long ago or what happened or why, but it was long enough ago that neither Pueblos nor Kiowas have any oral history about being together.
Wow. Yeah.
And oral history tends to survive pretty well, right? So it's remarkable.
Quite a long time.
Yeah.
And there are kind of some southwestern elements in Kiowa religion, like the Taime and that sort of thing, but which are like little bundles, like medicine bundles. There's also diffusion, so who knows? Right. So essentially, though, all this to say, adjectives, coming back to the adjectives, are something that's noticeable about Kiowa. And so even amongst different Indians in the area, the Kiowa language is known for having these adjectives.
And they were talking about this as non-linguists. They were giving you material, and they were using these words to teach you about how to speak Kiowa in your classes.
The anthropologist.
Yes. The anthropologist. And Parker was using these kind of words as well, or no?
Let's see. Parker would sometimes use those words, but usually he preferred to just describe it his own way. So, for instance, there's a common palatalization process by which certain consonants are pronounced more towards the middle of the mouth in certain phonological environments. So, for instance, for you linguists out there, velars become palatals before ah. So, and this applies for all the velar consonants. So, g, g, k, and and they're more pronounced, more like ya, kya, 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 right? So you get this y sound in it, and most people will write that with the y. And Parker, I don't know if he had this like Volapükian resistance to the y, or if he just thought, what's the point? But because this was a regular alternation, he wouldn't write that. But he wouldn't talk about palatalization. He would just say that g becomes, but he would talk about it he would find the generalizations. So he would say, well, these sounds turn into these sounds in these environments. So if you read it, it's like a wordy description where a linguist would just say palatalization.
Right, but it's almost, I think of it as refreshing because anyone can pick up that what Parker is writing and understand it.
In theory. Well, anyone could, right.
Yeah.
But not everyone would.
Sure. Yeah, but when you get a linguist writing some of these things, it becomes inaccessible. And I just, it just reminds me of, it's so great to have community members working on their language.
Right.
Because, it's just, I don't know, we need more linguists that are also community members or tribe members. Access. I think about access all the time when I think about these things.
Right. And I know, I've done, having with my NSF grant, and then I've done reviews as well. That's an increasingly important aspect of research now, is making sure that community members can access your results and not just academics.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So speaking of your grant, can you explain it for us? Like what are you trying to do with your grant?
It's the greatest grant in human history.
Everything did lead to this point.
Right, exactly. There's some NIH grants for studying childhood cancer, but by comparison. No. Okay. Now that was a joke, listeners.
You can't see his face, but really, it actually did not change between the joke and the...
But send your letters to Carrie and Megan. I'll forward your letters to them. No, it's a grant. The basic idea is to write a semantic grammar of Kiowa. And what do I mean by that? Essentially, it's a sort of reference grammar that is focused on the semantics and driven by theoretical questions and semantic questions, and also includes methodological discussion for people who don't know what I'm talking about. Basically. Sure. So I work in formal semantics, and you guys know what that is, right? It's using math and logic and very intricate formalism to see how language organizes meaning and how that interacts with structure.
That's what most of us non-semanticists hate about linguistics, is formal semantics.
I love it
because it's so hard. It
is hard until
it's not. Yeah, exactly.
There's no gradient. It's just flat, cliff, flat. And
yeah, it's true.
And I never had imposter syndrome until I was doing formal semantics, because that's I never felt like I got it.
Right.
Even as I was getting A's in class and writing papers and teaching courses, I was like, do I even know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
But everyone I've talked to, senior people and stuff, have felt the same. Like, this is just a normal way to feel.
Yeah. And we need to tell younger linguists more often that that's how we felt.
Yeah. And I tell my students that in semantics. Like,
good.
If you don't feel like you get this, that's normal.
Yeah.
In fact, you probably should feel that way for a bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you do get it, and I see that they get it, and that makes me happy.
And so part of your grant is making sure that a layperson can come and read this semantic grammar, or no?
Not quite a layperson, but at least a language teacher.
Okay.
And definitely other linguists.
Okay.
So the part for the lay people is like another stage, and we'll get to that.
Okay.
So reference grammars are a document of a language that tells you about the structures of the language and how it works, very in a surface way, like a structuralist tradition. And they're written for other linguists. Right? So they'll just say, these are the consonants and here are the adjectives and whatnot. But most of them were written before the rise of formal semantics. So they don't talk about these questions at all. Major questions like scope ambiguity, or modal base, or quantifiers. Besides listing a few, it turns out quantification is a major component of a lot of interpretation. And it's just not talked about, because most of the stuff was done before we knew anything about that. And most of the stuff since then has been done by linguists who weren't trained in semantics anyways. So it's not their expertise, and they don't really talk about it. There are a handful of exceptions, and there are some, and I found that there are some reference grammars that at least give enough information that you could, as a linguist, formulate a sense of it, even if they don't have a section called modal base. And it turns out these are important questions for different kinds of issues, even just typology. And Carrie, you know this firsthand about the typology of modal expressions.
So maybe explain what a modal expression is.
Yeah, so modals are ways of talking about the world not as it is, but as it could be or might be or so forth. And it turns out that's one of the most important aspects of human language as far as evolutionary strategy goes, because it allows us to plan. And not just to plan, but to communicate plans to each other. And we can talk about, what if we did this when we circled the wolf the next time, so Bill doesn't get bitten again, right? That sort of thing. It turns out that modals are also highly dependent on the context. Okay, so if I say, Bill has to be home by 8, then it turns out that there's ambiguity based on why he has to be home. Right? Is it because he's on parole and he'll run afoul of the law? Or is it because his favorite show is on and he can't record it, so he's got to be there by time, and so forth? Or is it just my supposition? Based on what I know about Bill, I'm deducing this. This has to be the case, right? And it turns out in English, the verb like have to is ambiguous. It doesn't mention which one of those it is, and you don't have to say it. And it turns out there's a lot of confusion in that realm because of that. I remember on the internet I got chewed out once.
Just once.
Well, there was some heinous crime, and I was being cynical about the justice system working, and I was like, oh, well, this guy should only get a few years in prison.
Oh, yeah, I see.
And should, like have to, it doesn't specify why things should be that way. And my thought was what we call epistemic, this deduction. Like, well, based on how the justice system works, I predict this is going to happen. But I didn't say that. So people interpreted that as what we call deontic, where based on the way the moral or legal rules and so forth, this is the better way for things to be. And so, and they rightly chewed me out for that, but they wrongly chewed me out in the sense that that's not what I had said, but it is what I had said, right? So this kind of modal base ambiguity turns out to be very messy, and in a lot of languages, things work completely differently. So instead of saying, I have to be home, or Bill has to go home, and it's not clear why he has to go home, your modal will instead specify why he has to go home, but it doesn't specify whether he needs to or might or has to. And it's just a completely different way of organizing the information. And so a lot of American languages especially do this. The Salish languages in the Pacific Northwest are famous for it, but we see it in other areas too. And in Kiowa, and there's this inflection you can put on the verb, and it can be translated as should, will, may, might, ought to, because it doesn't specify any of those. It just says that it's based on the facts of the world. This is a modal possibility. And so, right, that kind of thing isn't really described in these languages in very much detail. There's a lot of information that's in different articles and in different books that are organized, that are trying to answer theoretical questions. But there's not really a reference grammar where these are all put into one spot. And so that's what I'm doing for Kiowa. The closest thing I've seen to it is actually not in linguistics at all. It's in the classics literature. There's a couple of classicists whose last names are Devine and Stevens. I don't remember the first name. But they've been, in the last 15 years or so, they've been writing books analyzing ancient Greek and Latin from a generative perspective.
Oh, wow.
And so looking at the syntax, looking at, because we have a lot of corpora, and they can draw pretty good conclusions. But yeah, they go through like the formal semantics of Latin. Right? So, how does the number system actually work? How does tense and aspect get marked and that sort of thing? And but their book is of limited usefulness because it's written for classicists, so the examples aren't glossed. There's a lot of stuff like that, right? Now, I'm good enough at Latin. They do have translations, so I'm good enough at Latin that I can piece those apart when I want to. But yeah, it's so fair enough. Okay, but for the Kiowa one, it will have these discussions. The location system, which overlaps with the temporal marking system, the quantification, modals, evidentials, and so on and so on.
You have to explain what those are too.
No, I don't. I'll come back to that.
Okay.
But in most one way that will differ from other reference grammars, though, is that other reference grammars just tell you what the results are. Like, these are the structures. They don't really tell you how they arrived at that, except maybe at the beginning section or something. But this reference grammar specifically will discuss ways of finding out these things, especially if you can't find them in text. And so there's a lot of walking through different contexts and that sort of thing. So it's not just going to be, Kiowa can use this marker for strong epistemic modals. Right? It's like, how can you tell that that's a strong epistemic modal? And give examples that go through that. So there's an analysis in there. The idea is that people who aren't trained in formal semantics, which is still most linguists, sadly, can take these questions and these methods and ask the same kinds of questions in communities they work with. and do some and kind of get, because for Creek, for instance, there's a beautiful reference grammar of Creek from 2011 that Jack Martin wrote, and but it doesn't go into a lot of scope ambiguity. It's not his area, right? So if I can put tests that he could replicate in Creek, then maybe the next version will have that sort of thing, right? And as you can even see from the examples I've mentioned, this kind of thing is important for teachers and learners of the language, because it's really that element of meaning that I think learners really attach to anyways, but also which is hard to teach because it hasn't been documented. That's what my grant is about. Evidentials, coming back to evidentials. Evidentials are morphemes that indicate the source of your information. And in Kiowa, it's not very complicated. If you heard about something secondhand, then you have to mark the verb a certain way. And so if you say, bon, you saw him, then I have kind of firsthand evidence of that. But if I only heard about it from someone else, I'd have to say, bon hey, with this hail at the end. And then you get this, sort of hearsay notion. Now, it's not hearsay in the English sense where, I heard this, but I don't really believe it. It's true. I say it as true. It's just that I'm telling you I also heard it from someone. And in English, we have to mark tense, whether we like it or not. And in Kiowa, you have to mark evidentials, whether you like it or not. So it's just a feature of the grammar.
So what part of your grant is for the layperson then?
So in addition to making this reference grammar, and articles and such for publications and whatever, there are two things that I'm doing with teachers. One is organizing a summit of Kiowa teachers, where the idea is to get everyone together, talk about different issues. For instance, which writing system are we going to use, which is actually a major issue, and talk about strategies for what kinds of materials they're missing, or that they feel they're missing. Because that's really the thing I can help with the most. Also making some materials. So one of the things I've been making are little mini zines. So like these little one-page things you fold up into a booklet. And you can cover a little bit in each one. So for instance, I have one that talks about the evidentials, right? What is an evidential? How do you use it? And then with little pictures to illustrate. And then it fits into a little booklet that people can take with them and that sort of thing. And I'm working on one right now with some idiomatic expressions. And so things like that, like where you can make little materials. I'm not really making materials directly for classroom use. I'd rather let the teachers do that. And I work with them and talk with them, like, how do we turn this into something you can actually use? So things like, how do you build, how do you take post positions and attach them to things and that sort of thing. So I talk with teachers and I work with them about distilling this information. But I don't like to do that myself and then I guess what I don't want to do is make a bunch of materials for people and then just throw them at teachers and say, hey, use this. Because people have done that in the past, A, unsuccessfully, and B, even as a teacher, I know that I like to teach in my own voice. And so I think it fits, it's easier that way. So it's kind of this kind of delicate political balance where we want to do things that help people generally, and that's what these kinds of zines are for and that sort of thing. And things like this verb conjugation book that I put together. But some of those are for learners, some of those are just for ordinary people. So one of the things I've done just kind of completely to the side, is taken a bunch of Kiowa hymns. There's a well-known book of Kiowa Christian hymns that are everyone knows, they're really popular, and kind of broken them down, into a gloss for linguists, i.e. me, but also in a way that learners can see how words get put together, or because they know the sentence in Kiowa from singing it, and they know the translation in English, but it's that bridge. How do these parts get put together? And it shows them this with materials that I already know people want to have. Right? So little things like that, I guess. It's a lot of little things that kind of pull up together that way, and that works out pretty well for me.
And so you mentioned at the beginning of the interview that the folks that you talk to, the generation that speaks Kiowa natively, well, I hate that word, native, that grew up speaking it instead of having to go back and learn it. They're like 80, 90, but you said that they're in good health. You also mentioned how it's kind of like having this language work, or having your language and doing this stuff is kind of like a buffer against aging in a way, like kind of like, because it's so important, like emotionally, like intellectually, spiritually, for some people to have this and have this work. That do you see that with most of the speakers that you work with?
Yeah. Even the pessimistic ones, yes. There's a lot of joy in getting, or even in just hearing an old recording. Just hear, and a lot of people, even younger people, will just play the language in their car or something. Even younger people who have no idea what anyone's saying, but just even hearing the language, it adds this kind of this positive, this intangible positivity that I suppose psychologists are looking at. I don't know, maybe not actually, because you have to leave a college campus to figure this out. But yeah, it's a very positive sort of thing, and and I think there's also just the social aspect of it. Right? People are working together, meeting regularly, and if I don't call frequently enough, I hear about it. And there's a lot of pride that comes out of doing language work. Just being able to be proud of who you actually are is something that fuels people.
Do you find that I don't know, maybe just people that are monolingual in English, that grew up with English, maybe some people, as an example, don't understand how important it is to have that home or heritage language? Because I find that that's the case with some people, that they don't quite understand why a language matters so much.
You hear that. I mean, we have to make that case often with lawmakers, with policy leaders, the head of the NSF, depending on the administration, that sort of thing, right? And usually once you talk about it, then it becomes pretty clear. It's just one of those things. I think a lot of it just never occurs to people, or just the idea of having your heritage be sidelined in the first place is a foreign concept to a lot of people, especially English speakers in the U.S. notably. You get it a little bit with dialects, right? If people speak a non-prestigious dialect, but not quite to the same extent, especially since, at least for different Indian cultures, it wasn't just with the language, it was across the board. Right? The religions were banned, their clothes were replaced, their property systems were thrown out the window, and all this, every aspect of society was really changed and really pushed off to the side. And people were made to be, were embarrassed to be Indian. So after a generation or so, they didn't really have to teach people not to use their language and just do it themselves and that sort of thing. And I think that is something that kind of oppression is just something that we don't even think of as happening in the U.S. just generally. It's like we think, well, it's like that, other countries do that.
We've told ourselves a good story here.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Right? And it's like, we took their land and then history ended, sort of thing, right?
Yeah,
that's the mindset most people have. And and in a way, that's really where the history began.
Yeah.
More than it ended.
Yeah.
So so for that, it's always a struggle because you're always having to educate people. Not just that they're not just what the history is, but that there's even a question to ask. So the short answer was yes, I think, to that question.
Yeah, exactly.
So relatedly, why does documenting language, especially a language like Kiowa, matter?
So documenting a language, for one, it keeps it from dying. And in language, if you take a linguistics course, you probably are familiar with concepts of language. Language is having this kind of life cycle, and then when nobody speaks them anymore, they're extinct or dead. But in the last 20 years, the concept of death has really been beaten, I guess, in a way, replaced with this other concept called dormant, or sleeping if you don't want to use SAT level words, right? So, if you want to sound less academic, you can say sleeping, which is what dormant means, right? So, but I guess you could draw an analogy to a volcano, which is probably why it's called that, where an extinct volcano will never erupt again. A dormant volcano hasn't erupted in a long time, but it's still on the table. And with a language that's documented, then you can do that, right? It would take a lot of community effort, a lot of political will, and a lot of resources, but it's not. The door isn't closed. So you think of a language like Aranama, which was spoken in the Houston area way back in the day, and all we know about that language is one 2-word phrase, Hirianetsai, which means give me water. And it was remembered by a speaker of a different language, a Komekuruden, who was remembering this from years ago. So who knows how accurate that sentence even is. But that's literally all we know of this language. So that language cannot be brought back. When people ask me what the hardest language to learn is, that's what I give them. It's Aranama, because where are you going to learn?
That's a great answer. Oh my God.
You're not going to, there's nothing for you to learn it from. And at its heart, documentation is really that. It's really this preservation effort of figuring out exactly how this language works. And then with that conscious awareness, we can overcome the lack of subconscious transmission from one generation to the next, which is why these languages get dormant in the first place. And semantic documentation, I think, fills in this gap that maybe the last gap, really. Because we really know how phonology works. We really know how syntax works every 20 years. And theories come and go, but we do know how we do have a better idea of how syntax works, all joking aside. And we document languages really well in those ways now, but we don't for semantics. And part of that is because semantics arose recently, focusing on semantics arose recently, but it also goes all the way back to this documentary tradition, right? The documenting of languages really got going with the American anthropologists and ethnologists in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And they were heavily influenced by Bloomfield, Leonard Bloomfield, and Edward Sapir and folks like that. What they did was, for Bloomfield especially, the concept of semantics was weird because they were empiricists. They only focused on things that could actually be observed physically. And sounds can be observed physically, but meanings cannot. And so for them, the idea of trying to figure out what the semantics of a language is would require mind reading. And so there wasn't a point. That said, they encountered these morphemes in these languages, like evidentials and switch reference and obviation, and I could name a whole bunch of things that I won't define. But the point is, they had to figure out what these morphemes are, because morphemes are forms tied to meaning. They had to figure out what these meant. And in doing so, they basically were doing semantics. They just didn't call it that. But because they were focused on morphemes, then they organized their information by form, and that's affected the way that these languages get documented. And it shows us what's missing from that documentation. And a lot of that is crucial because it ties into the aspects of language that are communicative. And I know that communication is not the only purpose of language, but it is up there on the list. And so having that, how do these meanings work? Understanding how these meanings work turns out to be a really important issue. And how these meanings interact with the structure is also an important issue. And I think it's time to really start documenting those so that they can be preserved and passed along.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. Like, why does formal semantics matter? Because a lot of people do ignore it. And, obviously that was my passion. I feel like I'm always like pushing against this idea that it doesn't matter.
Yes.
But so, yeah, I think you did a pretty good job of answering that. But is there more you want to say about that?
Yeah, formal semantics is valuable for several reasons. And one of them is that it is precise. It allows us to make very clear observations about linguistic meaning and suss out when things are clear and when things are not. And this helps us understand why things are clear and why things are not. Well, I mentioned with these modals earlier, we know what parts of the modal is very clear, the quantificational aspect of it. And we can tell now which parts are very context-driven. Right? And you can separate those out. And you can tell which parts interact with the rest of the sentence and which parts don't, and so forth. And it also gives us a sense of these different kinds of meaning. Like there's assertive meaning, there is presupposition, there is implicature, And I like to tell people that when we're talking, there's more information in what we're not saying than in what we are saying. And a lot of that comes from these elements of meaning that are just not pronounced. So if they're not pronounced, how do you find them? Right? And so there's a methodology for that. We know how this works. And formal semantics allows us techniques to figure out when we encounter a morpheme. What parts of its meaning are asserted as true? What part of its meaning are assumed to be true? What parts of its meaning are implied, but you can let it go if you question it. Right? And these things turn out to be important too. They're important to document, not just for the individual morphemes, but even just the idea that the meaningful parts of language are complicated. They fit into different categories and they can be organized. And formal semantics lets us do that in precise ways that we can test in ways that other methods of analyzing linguistic meaning don't do as well.
Y'all are nerds.
Yeah, we're very nerdy. We're very nerdy.
Oh, yes. But it's a family tradition.
I love it.
There's a million more questions that we have, but it's an hour.
Yeah.
So thanks again for coming on.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me back.
And is there a way to say "don't be an asshole" in Kiowa?
It's not really for asshole in that sense.
Well, jerk or whatever,
Don't be a jerk.
Yeah.
Be nice.
There's a word for the actual physical body part, but it's not a taboo word.
Yeah, no.
It's
sure.
Kind of, yeah. I'm gonna say, don't be. What? How many people are we talking to here?
Let's say everybody who's listening, so a lot of people.
Yeah.
Okay, so, boy, but called it all.
Don't be a what?
All day is just like bad.
Don't be bad.
Okay,
Yeah,
don't be bad.
Like a bad, offensively bad person.
I thank our newest patrons for this month, Adam Bencato, or Bencato. Please let me know how to say that. Zoe Catherine, who told me how to pronounce her name, so thank you, Zoe. Inga Stockberger.
Ah, I recognize that name from Twitter.
And John Henner.
I recognize that name from Twitter too. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you to Carrie for being the one that pronounces the names.
Luckily, there was only one that I was like, maybe I'm going to say this wrong.
Yeah. Again, we're laughing at ourselves, not the fact it's very important to say people's names correctly and how they want you to say it. So
yes, it is.
But yes, thank you.
Yeah, and if you want to become a patron, you can join us at patreon.com/vocalfriespod. And you can join us at the $1 or $3 or $5 level.
Yeah.
And just as a reminder, we're so this month we can cover the transcriptions for this month, thanks to Jamie Thomas, a special donor on the side. But if you want to help us be able to do it for the future, then you can become a patron and help us become more accessible.
Yes. Thank you so much for helping an indie podcast.
The Vocal Fries podcast is produced by me, Carrie Gillen, for Halftone Audio. Theme music by Nick Granum. You can find us on Tumblr, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at VocalFriesPod. You can email us at vocalfriespod@gmail.com, and our website is vocalfriespod.com.